Faith can be a quiet storm or a fierce battle. Where do you stand? Hello. My name is Emily Carter. I am 28 years old. I grew up in a small town just outside of Cambridge, England. For most of my life, faith was a word I heard in church sermons, something distant and neat, but never quite part of my daily reality. I believed in God, yes, but my faith often felt fragile, like a candle flickering in the wind. It wasn't until a series of personal trials that I began to realize faith isn't a static thing. It has layers, depths I had never understood. It started quietly, with a simple plea in the darkest hours of my life. I was overwhelmed by uncertainty, job loss, family struggles, and a gnawing fear that I was utterly alone. I remember sitting on the cold floor of my tiny flat in Ely, surrounded by silence, whispering a prayer that was half desperate and half hopeful. Please, God, help me. That was the turning point, the first step into a journey of faith that would challenge everything I thought I knew. Looking back, that plea was just the beginning, the first level of faith I walked through. It was raw and imperfect, like a child reaching out to their parent after a fall, not knowing how to explain the pain but trusting there was safety in those arms. I wasn't asking for grand miracles yet, just for a sign that I wasn't forgotten. The days that followed were filled with waiting, with silent moments where I learned that faith sometimes means holding on even when you can't see the path ahead. This is the story of how my faith grew, how it moved through stages of asking, trusting, and finally abiding. It's about the quiet moments that change us from the inside out, the struggles that shape us, and the peace that eventually takes root when we learn to stay close to God even in the silence. If you've ever felt lost or wondered why your prayers seem unanswered, maybe you'll find something in my journey that speaks to you. Because faith isn't about perfection or speed. It's about the heart's movement towards something greater, even when the world feels uncertain. When I first cried out for help, it was the simplest kind of faith, one born from sheer necessity. I remember that evening vividly, the rain tapping gently against the window pane of my flat in Ely, the dim glow of streetlights casting long shadows across the room. I was exhausted, emotionally drained from months of uncertainty. My job had vanished without warning. My savings were dwindling, and the weight of responsibility pressed heavily on my shoulders. But in that moment, all I could do was reach out. Please, God, just help me get through this. I whispered, my voice barely above the sound of the rain. It wasn't a polished prayer, nor did it carry the confident tone I once imagined faithful people had. It was a simple, raw cry from a heart that knew it needed something greater than itself. That kind of faith, what I now understand as the faith that asks, is like a child running to their parent after a fall. It's not about knowing the right words or having all the answers. It's about recognizing your own weakness and trusting someone else to catch you. For me, it was the beginning of everything. The weeks that followed were filled with moments of doubt and fear. Sometimes I felt like my prayers were bouncing off the ceiling, unheard and unanswered. But then, there were small signs. An unexpected call from an old friend, a brief moment of peace in the chaos, that reminded me I wasn't alone. That even when God seemed silent, He was still there, listening. I learned that this first stage of faith isn't about getting everything you want immediately. It's the doorway, not the destination. It's a fragile beginning where we admit we can't fix everything on our own. And though it's filled with uncertainty, it's enough to make God stop and turn His attention toward us. As I clung to this newfound faith, I realized that asking was only the beginning. The real test was learning to trust when answers didn't come as quickly as I wished. It was the slow, steady step into a deeper relationship with God. One built not on results but on the quiet assurance that He was still working, even when I couldn't see it. This journey wasn't easy. Some days the silence felt deafening. But I began to understand that faith grows not just in the light of answered prayers, but in the dark soil of waiting and uncertainty. That's when I was ready to take the next step, moving from faith that asks to faith that trusts. The shift from asking to trusting wasn't sudden. It crept in quietly, like the soft dawn light after a long night. After months of pleading and hoping for change, I found myself in a strange place where the urgency faded, replaced by a calm that I hadn't expected. It was as if the frantic pounding on heaven's door softened into a steady knocking, accompanied by a deep sense that God was still present, even if he wasn't answering in the way I wanted. During this time, my life felt stuck. The job I'd lost was still out of reach, bills piled up, and the future seemed hazy. But in that haze, I began to notice something different happening inside me. I stopped asking, "Why isn't God moving?" and started asking, "What is God doing in me through this?" It was a subtle but profound change. I remembered stories I'd heard growing up, like Abraham, who waited decades for a promise that seemed impossible, or Job, who lost everything but still trusted God's goodness. Their faith wasn't about quick fixes or visible miracles. It was about trusting God's character when circumstances said otherwise. I realized I was stepping into that same kind of faith, the faith that trusts. Trusting faith doesn't mean pretending everything is fine. There were days when tears still came, when doubts whispered loudly, and when the silence felt unbearable. But even then, I held on to the quiet confidence that God's heart was good, even if his hands felt still. I learned to rest in that goodness, letting it be a refuge when the storm raged around me. This stage taught me that faith isn't measured by the speed of answers but by the strength to keep walking when the way is unclear. It's about surrendering control and saying, "I don't understand, but I believe you know best." That kind of faith has a steady rhythm, sometimes slow, sometimes faltering, but always moving forward. During that season, my prayers changed. They became less about demanding solutions and more about seeking God's presence. I found peace not in what I hoped for, but in the quiet assurance that I wasn't abandoned. It was a peace that didn't depend on sunshine but grew even in the darkest nights. Looking back, I realized that the faith that trusts is a deep and costly kind of faith. It asks us to let go of our timelines, our expectations, and even our certainty. But in that letting go, something beautiful happens. A transformation that reshapes our hearts and grounds us in a hope that no trial can shake. And just when I thought I understood this journey, I discovered there was a place beyond even trusting. A faith so profound, so intimate, that it changes everything. It's a place where faith ceases to be about asking or waiting and becomes simply about abiding. Abiding faith, that was a concept I'd heard tossed around in church sermons, but I never truly grasped it until I found myself living it. It's a faith that moves beyond the restless asking and the patient trusting, settling into something quiet, steady, and deeply rooted. It's like a branch connected to a strong vine. It doesn't strain or struggle to bear fruit. It simply remains, drawing life naturally and effortlessly. I remember one chilly morning in my flat, the early light spilling softly across the worn wooden floor, when it struck me how different my relationship with God had become. Instead of praying with a list of demands or desperate pleas, I opened my Bible and simply sat with the words, no rush, no agenda. I lingered on a single verse, letting it wash over me like a gentle wave. For the first time, prayer felt less like a task and more like a rhythm, a quiet communion with someone who was always there, whether I spoke or stayed silent. This abiding faith doesn't shout or clamor for attention. It doesn't hinge on miracles or loud answers. It's the kind of faith that Jesus had in the Garden of Gethsemane. Agonizing, yes, but ultimately surrendered. Not my will, but yours be done. It's the trust that your desires and God's plans can coexist in harmony, even when you don't understand the path. With this faith, I found a peace that wasn't fragile or conditional. It wasn't the kind that disappears when life gets hard. No, it was a peace that held firm even when everything around me felt like it was falling apart. I could lose jobs, friendships, plans, but the quiet confidence remained that I was held by a love that never wavered. At this stage, obedience wasn't a burden. It was a joy. Forgiveness came more naturally, and compassion grew in unexpected places. I began to see people differently, not as obstacles or burdens but as reflections of the same love that held me. Prayer became less about asking God to use me and more about making myself available to Him. The fruit of abiding faith is this deep, unshakable peace. It's a life that doesn't depend on the next miracle but flows from the constant presence of God. People around me began to notice it too. How, even in the face of hardship, I carried a calm that seemed almost otherworldly. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was simply living out the quiet confidence of a heart that had found its home. This is where God wants every believer to arrive. Not a place of frantic striving or anxious waiting, but a place of continual communion. To abide is to live in rhythm with his heart, to wake each day aware of his nearness, and to rest without fear of what tomorrow might bring. But, just as this faith seemed like the final destination, I discovered that it too carries its own challenges. Tests that push you even deeper. The journey isn't over. There's more ahead, and the waiting, the trusting, and the abiding all have their tests. And those tests, they reveal what kind of faith truly lives inside us. Waiting, no one escapes it. It's the quiet test that stretches faith beyond what we think we can endure. After reaching that place of abiding faith, I thought my journey would smooth out, but instead, I found myself face to face with the hardest challenge yet, the test of waiting. It was during a particularly bleak winter in my little cottage on the outskirts of Norwich. The days were short, the nights long and cold, and the silence felt heavier than ever. Promises I thought were near seemed to drift further away. The prayers I whispered daily felt like echoes in an empty room. It was as if God had stepped back, leaving me to wrestle with uncertainty and longing. Waiting is a strange season. It's neither punishment nor neglect. It's preparation. It's the soil where faith takes root and grows deep, even when you can't see it happening. But it's also the season where doubt creeps in, where frustration boils just beneath the surface, and where the enemy's whispers threaten to drown out hope. I remember lying awake many nights, questioning if I had heard God right at all. Was this silence a sign of abandonment? Had I misunderstood his promises? Those thoughts clawed at my heart, and yet, somewhere beneath the noise, a small voice kept whispering, "Don't quit. God is still working." The test of waiting taught me 3 vital lessons. First, the power of holding onto God's promises. I found a verse from Isaiah and clung to it, repeating it like a lifeline when everything else felt uncertain. The words became my daily bread, a reminder that God's faithfulness doesn't depend on my feelings or circumstances. Second, the importance of small, consistent acts of faithfulness. When passion waned, I learned to pray short prayers often, to give thanks for the smallest blessings, and to stay faithful in the little things before me. These quiet disciplines kept my spirit soft and open while the miracle I longed for matured unseen. Third, I discovered the necessity of community. Waiting is not meant to be endured alone. I leaned on friends, family, and fellow believers who reminded me of God's goodness when my memory failed. Sometimes, just having someone say, "Hold on, he isn't finished," was enough to keep me going. This waiting period reshaped me. It broke down my pride, built patience, and stretched my endurance beyond what I thought possible. I learned to stop forcing outcomes and start trusting God's timing, even when it felt endless. Looking back, I see now that the silence was never absence. It was God's workshop, shaping me quietly, pruning away impatience and fear until my heart beat in rhythm with his. And though the waiting felt like a desert, it was fertile ground for faith to grow strong and steady. But just when I thought I understood this test, life threw me a curveball, a story that would shake everything I thought I knew about faith and waiting. It began with a friend whose journey would mirror my own, yet unfold in ways I never expected. My friend James was the kind of person you'd call a true believer. Full of energy and hope, he carried his faith like a bright lantern, lighting up every room he entered. We met during university, and over the years, I watched him navigate life's ups and downs with a steady trust that seemed unshakable. But one year everything changed. James lost his job unexpectedly, a blow that shook the foundation of his confidence. His savings quickly vanished, and with them, his sense of security. Yet what hurt him most wasn't the loss itself. It was the deafening silence that followed. Night after night, he prayed, begging God for direction, for a sign, for anything. But the silence remained. I remember visiting him in his small flat in Norwich. The walls seemed to close in on him, bearing witness to his frustration and quiet despair. He confessed, "Emily, I feel like I'm talking to a closed door. There's no sin, no rebellion, just this aching waiting. His faith, once so vibrant, seemed to flicker under the weight of unanswered prayers. At first, James's faith was like the one I had known early on, the faith that asks. He prayed hard, fasted, declared promises. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, his cries grew quieter, more subdued. One evening, he said something that stayed with me. "I'm done asking God to fix this. I just want him to be here." That moment was a turning point, a subtle shift from faith that asks to faith that trusts. James stopped demanding answers and began resting in the goodness of God's character, even when the circumstances didn't change. He told me, "If all I have left is you, Lord, that's enough." Though his situation remained difficult. No new job, no financial breakthrough. The peace that settled over him was palpable. It was as if a warm blanket wrapped around his soul, quieting the anxiety that once ruled him. He started thanking God, not for what was changing, but for what wasn't destroyed. His faith, his family, his hope. James's journey didn't stop there. One morning, while reading the Gospel of John, he paused at the words, "Abide in me." Suddenly, he saw that he had been chasing answers rather than dwelling in God's presence. He began to spend his mornings differently. Sitting quietly with his Bible open, sometimes reading a verse, sometimes just resting in silence. Slowly, the anxiety that had gripped him began to fade. His soul started to breathe again. Then, quite unexpectedly, a job opportunity appeared. The company said his name had come up during a meeting, almost out of nowhere. But by then, James wasn't desperate for the job, he was content. When he shared the news, he smiled and said something I'll never forget. "The job isn't the miracle. The miracle already happened inside me." His faith had transformed from frantic asking to peaceful abiding. A journey I had once walked myself, now mirrored in his story. James's story is a powerful reminder. Faith isn't just about getting what we want. It's about who we become while we wait, trust, and abide. And for those of us still struggling in the silence, it offers hope that the greatest miracle is often the transformation of our hearts. But just when I thought I understood the full circle of faith, life had one more twist in store, one that would challenge everything I believed about faith, waiting, and miracles. The unexpected twist came one gray afternoon when I received a call from James. His voice was shaky, almost unrecognizable. He told me something that left me breathless. The job he had waited for, the one that seemed like a blessing, was suddenly in jeopardy. The company had pulled back their offer without explanation. I could hear the weight of disappointment crushing him through the phone. After months of peace, the fragile calm he had built felt like it was unraveling. "Emily," he whispered, "I don't know how to handle this. I thought I was done with the waiting, but now it's like I'm back to square one." That moment shook me to the core. Here was a man who had walked the long road of faith, asking, trusting, abiding, and yet, the very thing he hoped for slipped away. It was a brutal reminder that faith isn't a straight path, nor does it promise perfect outcomes. Sometimes, the tests continue, even when we think we've reached the end. But then James said something that stopped me in my tracks. "Maybe this isn't about the job anymore," he said slowly. "Maybe it's about learning to trust God through the disappointment, to keep abiding even when the answers we long for don't come." His words echoed in my mind long after the call ended. It was a challenge and a comfort. Faith, I realized, isn't just about the victories or the moments of peace. It's about what happens when those moments slip away, when the silence deepens, and we have no choice but to cling tighter. Suddenly, the whole journey took on a new meaning. The stages of faith, asking, trusting, abiding, weren't just steps to reach a destination. They were rhythms to live by, especially during the hardest seasons when nothing seems to change. James's new trial reminded me that faith is a living thing. It grows, it stumbles, it is tested again and again. Sometimes it shines bright, other times it flickers in the dark. But the heart of faith is the refusal to let go, even when everything feels uncertain. And just as I was beginning to process this, another surprising event unfolded. One that would cast everything in a new light and force me to confront the deepest question of all. What if faith isn't about waiting for miracles but becoming one? The story was far from over. The next chapter promised to reveal truths I hadn't expected, challenges I wasn't prepared for, and a revelation that would change everything I thought I knew about faith, hope, and the unseen work of God in our lives. The revelation came quietly, almost unnoticed, during one ordinary evening in my Norwich flat. I had been helping James process his disappointment, encouraging him to keep trusting despite the setback. But as the days passed, I began to notice a subtle change. Not just in him, but in myself. Faith, I realized, wasn't just about waiting for God to act. It was about becoming an embodiment of His presence, being a living miracle in a world that desperately needed hope. The more I reflected on James's journey, the more it became clear that the greatest transformation happens not when our circumstances shift, but when our hearts do. It was like stepping into a new season where faith no longer depended on answers or outcomes. Instead, it became a steady flame burning within, a light that shone out from the quiet places of pain, doubt, and waiting. This faith was alive, vibrant, and deeply rooted, not because it was easy, but because it had been refined by fire. I started to see that the real miracle wasn't the job, the healing, or the breakthrough we prayed for. It was the peace that passes understanding, the resilience that grows in silence, and the love that flows even when it's hard. It was the way James carried hope into every room, even when his own heart ached. This kind of faith creates something extraordinary, a living testimony that doesn't rely on spectacular signs or dramatic moments. It's a quiet strength that whispers, "I am here, and I am not afraid," even when the storm rages on. That evening, I sat by my window as the sun dipped below the horizon. The sky was painted with soft hues of pink and gold, a reminder that even after the darkest days, light returns. I understood then that faith is not a destination but a journey that invites us to keep moving forward, to keep trusting, and above all, to keep abiding. But just as I embraced this truth, a new question began to take root in my mind, one that would challenge everything I thought I knew. If faith is becoming the miracle, then what happens when the world expects us to prove it? That question would soon lead me down a path filled with unexpected encounters, difficult choices, and a test of faith unlike any before. The journey was far from over, and the next chapter promised to be the most intense yet. The question lingered in my mind like a shadow I couldn't shake. What happens when the world demands proof of the faith we carry inside? It's one thing to hold on to quiet confidence in the privacy of our hearts, but quite another when that faith is tested openly, when others watch and wait, expecting miracles or answers on demand. Not long after that evening by the window, I found myself thrust into such a moment. It came unexpectedly during a small gathering at the local community center in Norwich, where I volunteered. Among those attending was a woman named Claire, a striking figure, dressed in a sleek navy dress that hugged her tall frame, her dark hair falling in soft waves around her face. She moved with a quiet confidence, but her eyes held stories of struggle and pain. Claire's presence stirred something in me. Over the weeks, she shared pieces of her journey. Loss, betrayal, and a faith battered but not broken. She was seeking answers, wrestling with doubt, much like I had once done. One evening, during a particularly raw conversation, she asked me, "Emily, how do you keep believing when everything falls apart?" Her question hit me like a thunderclap. I realized that while I had learned to abide in faith, the real challenge was living it out loud, being a witness not just through words, but through action and presence. It was no longer enough to quietly trust in the shadows. Faith had to be visible, tangible, and real for those around me. That night, as I walked home through the misty streets of Norwich, I felt the weight of that reality press down. To live abiding faith meant vulnerability, courage, and sometimes sacrifice. It meant standing firm when the world doubted, loving when it rejected, and hoping when despair threatened to consume. Claire's story intertwined with mine, and together, we faced moments that tested our patience and perseverance. There were times when the silence returned, thick and heavy, threatening to swallow our hope whole. But in those moments I discovered that faith, true faith, is not about having all the answers. It's about choosing to stand firm anyway. As these days unfolded, I began to see a larger picture emerge. Faith isn't just a private refuge. It's a living force that shapes communities, heals wounds, and challenges the status quo. It's a revolution of the heart that starts quietly but can't be contained. Yet, just when I thought I was beginning to understand what it meant to live faith out loud, an event unfolded that would force me and Claire into the eye of a storm neither of us expected. One that would test not only our faith but our very identities. The journey was reaching a crescendo, and the next chapter would reveal whether abiding faith could truly withstand the fiercest trials. The storm hit without warning. It started with a simple disagreement at the community center, an argument over funding that quickly spiraled into something much larger. Claire and I found ourselves at the center of a heated debate, accused by some of stirring unrest simply because we dared to question the status quo. The quiet faith we carried was suddenly thrust into the spotlight, challenged by voices that demanded visible proof and tangible results. Claire, usually composed, wore a navy dress that evening, the fabric smooth against her skin, her slender fingers twisting nervously in her lap. Her eyes, usually steady, flickered with uncertainty. I sat beside her, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on us both. It was more than a disagreement, it was a test of who we were and what we believed. They wanted miracles, answers, immediate change. But faith, I reminded myself, often works quietly beneath the surface. It grows in the waiting, the trusting, and the abiding, even when no one sees. Yet the pressure to perform, to prove, was suffocating. In the days that followed, whispers started to circulate, questions about our motives, doubts about our sincerity. It felt as though the very foundation of our faith was being shaken. I struggled with fear and frustration, wondering if I had the strength to stand firm. But then I remembered James's words. Maybe it's about learning to trust God through the disappointment, to keep abiding even when the answers we long for don't come. That quiet voice within me grew louder, reminding me that faith isn't about perfection or proof. It's about perseverance. Claire and I decided to face the storm together. We began hosting small gatherings, not to dazzle with miracles, but to share stories of hope and endurance. We invited people to bring their doubts, their pain, their questions, and instead of answers, we offered presence. Slowly, the atmosphere shifted. People began to see that faith wasn't a show to be judged, but a journey to be shared. The pressure to perform eased, replaced by a growing community of real, imperfect people embracing the uncertainty together. Yet, even as the storm calmed, a new challenge loomed, one that would demand everything we had learned. An unexpected visitor arrived in town, someone from Claire's past, whose presence threatened to unravel the fragile peace we had built. This arrival would force us to confront secrets, fears, and truths long buried. It was a test not just of faith, but of forgiveness, courage, and the very nature of grace. And as the tension mounted, I realized that the journey of faith is never truly over. It's a continuous unfolding, ever deeper and more demanding than we imagine. The next chapter was waiting, full of questions no one could answer, except the one who holds us through every storm.